Finally, the last episode to the series. Technically, I started it a year and a half ago, but in this video I finally completed, proving that a world like this is possible. In the last episode, I finished off the video saying the lunatic cultist might be pretty easy, or at least not harder than any boss so far. And although it might be possible to kill it normally, I decided it was going to be way easier to cheese it. But first I had to find a way to do this, and like the golem, I could not find a way to cheese it online. But eventually I found a way of doing this, and if done correctly, it would allow me to kill it without taking any damage. And to do this I needed a whip, and the best whip I could get came from the wall of flesh. So on day 302, that's what I did. I killed the wall of flesh and eventually got the whip. I then started making the arena. It utilizes a hoink setup like this, which allows me to dodge the projectiles. In theory, with fast enough reflexes, it allows me to press down and hoik to a different location. This allows me to completely dodge the projectiles without taking any damage, but it doesn't necessarily require fast reflexes, as you can also memorize the attacks of the lunatic cultist. It turns out this is actually mentioned on the wiki, but back when I came up with this strategy it was not the case, so I had to look through the code. So I created this mod which would display some information along with the different stages. So all I had to do was memorize them, which I did. I also took a screenshot just so I would know what phase it was on if I ever forgot. And also autopause was pretty helpful here. But anyways, I'm sure you want to see me actually kill it. So on day 306 I spawned it and it was working pretty well. However, I did not take into account being third-partied by a wraith. I was doing it at night to get the moon charm bonus, but I figured because there was no time limit and I wasn't going to take damage, I could do it during the day. So that's what I did, and on day 307 I tried it during the day, but this time was killed by a slime. So the next day I tried again, but this time placing walls. And then I realized that the stars could end up on the path. So I paused here for a while thinking I was gonna die, but luckily it despawned right as I was heading to the next location. And eventually I ended up killing it, but unfortunately died almost instantly to a vortex pillar enemy. I did end up pausing the game between killing it and dying, but failed to see the enemy that was gonna spawn right on the player. If I remove the frames that I was paused, you can see that I die almost instantly. But that's not the worst part. Right after this, I end up leaving the world to get the playtime to label the recording, but then realized that because I left the world, the ancient manipulator despawned. So I had to steal one from a different world, which I considered cheating, but if I was paying more attention, this wouldn't have happened. But anyways, now for the pillars. I spent days 309 to 312 killing enemies and then eventually getting the lunar fragments. And after crafting some weapons out of them, the Moonlord spawned. But unsurprisingly, I died doing very little damage. But if this is the case, how am I going to kill the Moonlord? Well, I planned on using beach balls to fill all of the projectile slots. This means I would be able to do damage without any of his projectiles hitting me, which means weapons that do not spawn a projectile are going to be the only way to kill it. But this would make killing the final heart hard to do, as no swords can hit 5 blocks below the player. And I couldn't just keep falling, as the true Eye of Cthulhu's would almost definitely kill me. And the easiest way I found to dodge them was using a conveyor system like this, which allows me to just outrun them without taking any damage, but I still needed to figure out how I was going to do damage. Well, from what I found, a lance was going to be the best option. But I'm sure some people are wondering, the lance is a projectile, so how am I going to do this if I already have all the projectile slots filled? Well, before I spawn any beach balls, I can use a minion like the slime staff to fill up one of the slots. And for those who don't know, all minions and pets are considered projectiles. So after I open the Moonlord's heart, I'm able to remove my minion and then use the lance. This then refills all of the projectile slots. So now you know the strategy. I had to create the arena. And because I needed a conveyor belt from one side of the world to the other 2 times, I would need 8,000 conveyors in total. But first, to even spawn the Moonlord, I had to do it on my own accord, which means I would have to manually spawn it with the spawner to get an optimal advantage. This also allows me to do it at night and do extra damage. But to do this, I would need more lunar fragments. So on day 313, I re-killed the lunatic cultist. And 3 days later, on day 316, I had the Moonlord spawn again after killing all of the pillars. But this time, I somehow managed to die to the pillar enemies and then the Moonlord just despawned. But now I needed to create the arena. So I bought the 8,000 required conveyor belts and then started building. And while doing it, I managed to get a pirate map from a wyvern, but unfortunately without 200 health, I'm unable to use it. But on day 318, I finished the conveyor belts and was ready to kill the Moonlord. But first, I had to spawn 999 beach balls, or 998, I don't think the 1000th projectile exists normally. I do plan on looking into this and seeing what glitches can be done by a ghost projectile, as I'm gonna call them. But let's get back to the video. I'm sure out of all the people watching, there is at least one person who saw Chief Logan's video on beating Terraria without picking up any items. And if you watch the start of the Moonlord fight, you know that placing this many beach balls takes a long time. And according to Terraciel's video, 1 beach ball a second would take just over 16.5 minutes. But that number is pretty generous, as with an auto clicker and a program that allows me to use the mouse with the arrow keys, it took me 20 minutes to get around 580. But after all that, this happened. It turns out there was a lightning strike which caused an electrical surge which shut off my monitor, so Terraria's rendering engine tried drawing to a screen that didn't exist, and so the game crashed. It turns out using your computer during a severe thunderstorm is a bad idea, but at this point I didn't know that, so I relaunched Terraria and tried again, and after around 40 minutes of placing beach balls I was up to 800, and then the power went out, which not only means Terraria crashed but my entire computer with everything running on it shut down. So I spent an hour in total just placing beach balls just to lose all that progress. But eventually the power came back on and then I tried it again. And because I had done this for an hour before, I had everything set up to do it quite efficiently. So after placing all of the beach balls, I spawned the Moonlord and then started attacking it. For those who don't know, the eyes while attached to the Moonlord do not do any damage. So for the top eye, I'm able to hold up on a rope and do a lot of damage. And once that eye was almost down, I was able to move on to the hands. So I was able to use my horse and the conveyor belts to stay ahead of the Moonlord. But there was a slight problem. I was using the Stardust Dragon instead of the Slime Staff because it would do more damage. But it did too much damage and spawned one of the true Eye of Cthulhu's when I was not ready. In theory this wouldn't be an issue, but I somehow managed to forget the strategy to dodge it. I had practiced the Moonlord multiple times in a test world and managed to do it every time. But between that and actually doing it there was a 2-week period where I was working on the Terraria Android 1.0 video, which for those who saw that I will be making a part 2. But anyways, after respawning I was able to try the Moonlord again. And it should be noted that just because I died, all the beach balls did not despawn, meaning all I had to do was spawn a summon and all the projectile slots were full. So finally on day 321, 128 hours into this challenge, and after 10 minutes of doing damage, I was finally able to kill it. From what I can tell, this is the hardest skyblock map that I've seen so far, as Chief Logan's playthrough through Shimmering Skies only took 85 hours. Now it should be mentioned that technically less harder skyblocks can take longer to play, as Frostburn took 261 hours to beat the game in a world with nothing, which I made a video on. And because glitches were allowed, it means that almost every item was possible to get, and even if he did limit himself, he was still able to get water, which means better accessories, armor, and life crystals are possible to get. And from experience, it's fishing for heart crystals that cause the hours to go way up. As in Terrablock, an abandoned Sky Island map that I was playing with friends, I ended up spending over 200 hours just fishing for life crystals, but as we can see now, those life crystals were not necessary, and a world starting on only 2 mud blocks is completely possible, even though it required strategies that had not been seen before on YouTube. But in the title you'll see I said I spent 400 days in this world, not 321 like I have so far, so I still had another 79 days to go, but I eventually opened the treasure bag and got what you'd expect. But some things of note is I got Luminite, the Celestial Starboard, and the Meowmere, so I then created the Solar Flare helmet. This helmet alone gave me more defense than all of my armor and accessories, but I didn't have enough for the full set, so I had to kill the Moonlord once again. This time with the Meowmere I was able to do more damage, and because I didn't leave the world yet, all of the beach balls were still there, so I then killed it a second time and created the full Solar Flare armor. And at this point you may be wondering, what is there left to do in the world? You may think that I can now get Shimmer, but unfortunately this is not the case, as getting the bottomless Shimmer bucket requires a bottomless water bucket, and without water this is not possible to get, but what is possible to get is stone. For those who are in my Discord server, you'd already know, after the Moonlord is killed, the steampunk sells more solutions. And now with the yellow, brown, and white solutions, I'm able to convert some background walls into desert, forest, and snow biome walls. However, on the wiki, it seems like they're all converted into unsafe walls, meaning unfortunately the item does not drop. And because background walls don't count for biomes, there is one exception, but we'll talk about that later, you would assume that this isn't overly helpful. However, there is one conversion that allows you to get safe walls, and that is the brown solution. It can convert any of these walls into safe stone walls. This would allow me to mine the walls and then craft them back into stone. But first I had to figure out how to get any of these walls. And luckily, using the yellow or white solutions, I'm able to create sandstone or ice walls. These can be converted from either the ivy or lichen stone walls, which despite having stone in them only requires grass seeds, which can be bought from the Dryad. Here's an image representation of what I'm talking about. But as you can see, after converting ivy walls into ice walls, I can then convert them into stone walls. I can then craft these into stone. Now you may be wondering, why do I even need stone? Well, stone allows me to craft a furnace. And with this furnace, I'm able to craft ores from slimes into bars. I was then able to create a sawmill, which unfortunately I wasn't recording for, but either way it isn't overly helpful. But that's not the only thing that stone can be used for. I'm able to convert it into Crimson, Corruption, and the Hollow, which allows me to get Souls of Night and Light, but without a Mithril Anvil I basically can't use them. But with all this many days left, I figured I would do it anyways. But first, how am I gonna get these 2 biomes? But the corruption is the easy part, as all I had to do was spray it with purple solution. This can be obtained from a steampunk during the solar eclipse. But the crimson on the other hand is slightly harder, as the only way to get crimson currently is from these 2 mud blocks. So I had to place some stone around it and wait for it to spread. But while waiting for that to happen, on day 223 I created an underground corruption, which didn't really give me anything interesting, but I was able to kill a corrupt mimic. But at this point I wanted a hollow biome. biome. The only thing interesting that can come from this is the Rod of Discord, which would be very helpful. But first I had to figure out how to get that. As up to this point, there was no way of getting the hollow biome. I could get hollowed seeds from the Dryad, but that wouldn't really help with nothing to plant it on. I could get blue solution from her as well, however that would first require the hollow. But there is a way to get hollow. In fact, there's a way to get sand, snow, and even dirt. Remember when I said there was one exception to walls not counting as biomes? Although sandstone walls don't count as a biome, desert enemies can spawn on them. Meaning all I had to do was get sandstone walls underground and have an antlion spawn. This antlion could then give me infinite sand, which I'm sure people who have played Shimmering Skies are quite familiar with. I could then use brown and white solution to convert this sand into dirt and snow. The dirt would allow me to get grass and then the hollow. Not only that, but it would allow me to get trees, which until now could only be done from these two mud blocks. And the snow allows me to get a snow biome. Now it should be noted that you can convert stone into ice using the white solution, which also counts for a snow biome, but I think snow is better. Now from what I can tell, dirt can lead to more mud despite there being no water, but we'll get into that later and explain why it would take a very long time. But anyways, I then converted some walls into unsafe sandstone walls, and before long I was able to get a couple antlions to spawn, which would allow me to get infinite sand. I also realized that the golfer spawned. I completely forgot about him before, but he would now allow me to buy chests without spending any iron. But I then started AFKing to get sand, and on day 329 I ended up having 3000 sand. I then moved up to the surface and converted some of that sand into dirt and snow. And now with the dirt on day 331 I was able to get the hollow, and now with the hollow available, the Empress of Light and Queen Slime would now be possible to kill, which means that is my next challenge. But first I had enough crimson blocks to make a crimson biome. So I went back underground and created a crimson biome, but like the corruption, there wasn't really anything I needed. And then I created an underground hollowed biome. This would allow me to get the Rod of Discord, but also gelatin crystals for the Queen Slime. But while waiting for those crystals to spawn, I figured I'd make a giant lava pool. I was hoping eventually I would find a way to fish in lava, but unfortunately that never happened. But as far as I'm aware, without glitches, it is impossible. I then created a bucket with a new furnace and started duplicating lava. And then after 30 minutes of duplicating lava, I had a giant pool. I then realized I could have just used liquid rockets. But anyways, on day 335, there was a gelatin crystal that spawned. So I planned on killing that, but first I wanted to farm in the underground desert and ice biome. There was nothing really of note besides I got an ice shell, which usually would be helpful because it reduces damage, but I had to be under 50% health, and if I'm one shot anyways, it wasn't overly helpful. So on day 336, I then spawned and killed the Queen Slime. It was pretty easy, but to be fair, I did have post-Moonlord weapons, which means the last boss to kill was the Empress of Light, which would definitely be more of a challenge than this. So after collecting a couple prismatic lace wings, on day 337 I then attempted the Empress of Light. Now despite me having over 9,000 hours in this game, I had never actually defeated this boss, so I ended up dying on the first try. But on the second try I had more luck, and this time I did actually kill it, which now meant that I was able to get the Saurian insignia, which would allow me to fly forever. And paired with the Celestial Starboard, I was able to fly anywhere in the world pretty easily. This is very helpful in a world that is almost completely empty. So I had ended up killing all the bosses that were possible. But while playing, I actually thought there was another one. The Deercloth spawns naturally, so I figured that could be the last boss. So I then created a snow biome on the surface and waited for it to rain. And unfortunately it took a while, but while doing so, I decided to create a loom and then the item that spawns the Goblin Invasion. But just like any other invasion, it's not possible to spawn without more health. And then on day 339 I created a platinum watch. Although it's not overly helpful, it does allow me to tell the time without cheating. I then realized that pixie dust and harpy feathers are completely unusable. Both required a hard mode anvil or was used in potions. But after that, on day 340, I got a nymph banner. In most worlds, once you get a nymph banner, it means that you've been playing for too long. But just wait until you realize how many I got at the end of this challenge. I then also realized that with sand, I'm able to get the angler. In Terrablock, water was possible but not sand, and in this world, sand is possible but not water. In that world, I could fish but not get the angler, and in this world, I could get the angler but not fish. However, because I could get the angler, I then looked into ways I could maybe get the quest fish. The wiki says all of them can be fished in water except for one of them. The bumblebee tuna is the only quest fish that can be caught in honey, which means in theory if there was a way to catch this fish I would be able to get water. But after spending many hours on the wiki, there is just no way of getting honey. I then looked into ways of getting water and all of them required another liquid, but no other liquid is possible to get. And it was at this point where I was realizing there's really nothing else to do in this world. I had killed every boss and progressed as far as I could. So on day 346, I decided to see if I could collect every banner. So I then created a place for all the banners to go and filled them with all the ones that I currently had. And I figured the easiest banners I could get were the ones from the lunar pillars. So I killed the lunatic cultist again quite easily with post-Moonlord items, and then got all but one banner. I thought I had this last one, but unfortunately I did not. And then eventually the Moonlord spawned, and without the beach balls he was able to attack me and one-shot me with his laser. And on day 349, I then got the ice slime mummy and some underground desert banners, and then happened to obtain a bloody tear. This was the second one I had gotten in this entire playthrough. So while waiting for night, I farmed in the underground corruption and got a corrupt key. Although it's rare, it is completely useless in this world. And then once night came, I then spawned the Blood Moon. Like mentioned in the first 100 days, the Blood Moon does not require health to spawn. But anyways, I was able to get back 2 bloody tears, a KO cannon, and a couple banners. And finally got a money trough. It only took me 300 days to do it, but I finally got it. On day 350, I then realized that it had started raining, so I moved to the ice biome, where I farmed ice golems ultimately for the banner. I ended up getting many frost cores and ice feathers, which unfortunately I cannot use. And this is when I also realized that the deer cloth requires 200 health to spawn. And then on day 352 I used all the souls of light that I got to farm hollowed mimics, where I eventually got the banner. And then on day 357 I realized that I could use bombs to get more dirt. And then after creating a lot of dirt, I then converted that to snow and then farmed in the underground ice biome. I then added some corruption blocks to get Pigron, and then farmed for an hour to get most of the available banners. And then on day 364 it started raining again, so I got the Ice Golem banner. There was also a solar eclipse right after this, and unlike the last 100 days I was able to kill the Mothron multiple times. This allowed me to get the Broken Hero Swords, the Wings, and the Yo-Yo, all of which are completely useless, except for the Broken Hero Sword. So on day 366 I created a Terra Toilet. Besides being able to sit on it, it does absolutely nothing. I then decided to farm down in the underground hollowed biome for the Rod of Discord. And then on day 371 I killed 1000 Chaos Elementals. Unfortunately I somehow did not get the Rod of Discord out of all of those kills. So on day 381 I finally got the Rod of Discord. I only had to kill over 1900 of them. And by the way, at this point I had killed over 100 nymphs. I also tried the Moonlord again now with this new acquired Rod of Discord, but unfortunately dodging the laser was just too hard. And despite having the best armor and weapons I could get, I still died one shot, but at this point there was almost nothing to do. There was nothing to do progression wise, and I didn't really want to farm for all of the banners. However, there was one thing that I was trying to do. Remember after I got the hollow I said that you could technically get mud? Well, it turns out all you need to create chlorophyte is 1 mud block and 1 jungle grass block, both of which can be obtained in this world. And there's a little known feature that dirt blocks can be converted into mud using chlorophyte. So in theory, if I can then get 1 block of chlorophyte, I can then convert dirt into mud, thus allowing me to get a jungle biome, which can give me the honey dispenser, which I can't use, or a pylon, which isn't overly helpful. And it could increase the chance of getting Plantera spawns or life fruits. Life fruits I can't even use, and Plantera isn't overly helpful. So despite the jungle being basically completely useless, I decided to see if I could even get a chlorophyte block. So all the way back on day 331, before I had even killed the queen slime, I set up a spot where it could technically spawn. But I'm sure you want to know the actual chance of this happening. Well, because this is a small world, there are only 5 million blocks in it, and every time the game is updated, it randomly selects 226 blocks to be updated, meaning there is a 1 in just under 22,500 chance that the jungle grass block is updated, and then there's a 1 in 300 chance that it's even going to grow chlorophyte, and then it has to find a mud block to grow on, which it does by randomly selecting an X and Y position, meaning there is a 1 in 20 chance that it is the correct X coordinate and a 1 in 20 chance that it is the correct Y coordinate. It turns out after doing some math, it would take on average just under 1.5 years for chlorophyte to grow. That's not years in game, that's years in real life. But again, with nothing else to do, I brought my Terra Toilet down to the jungle grass block to wait out the rest of the 100 days. But unsurprisingly, I never got one to spawn. Every once in a while, there was a piece of grass that grew, meaning it's definitely possible for chlorophyte to grow, but like I said, it didn't happen. So after waiting 17 days, I eventually reached day 400. That's 160 hours in this world. Now despite this, it did only take me 128 to beat it. But anyways, I'm finally done this challenge and this world. I will probably post a full movie of all 5 videos on my channel, containing probably some extra content and removing some inaccuracies. But ever since I started this challenge, I'd wondered if for the worthy skyblock was possible. Most of the bosses I was able to kill without taking any damage, which leads me to believe that with the right setup, it might be possible. Which if you don't believe that this is the hardest skyblock, you probably would believe that that is. But that's it for this video. I have some other non-skyblock videos planned, so subscribe if you want.